Hello, my name's Ruth McPherson. I'm Head of Charity Development at the ISM. A very warm welcome to this ISM Trust webinar about staying mentally and physically well as a musician with Lucy Heyman. This is the second in a series of 3 ISM Trust webinars to support music professionals during the current cost of living crisis, which is causing significant difficulties across our sector. The ISM Trust is the ISM's sister charity, and we offer high quality professional development to everyone working in music. Through the ISM Trust, the ISM gives back to the sector and supports and empowers music professionals to succeed. Just before we begin, I have a couple of points of housekeeping. So during Lucy's presentation, please do feel free to ask questions using the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to answer these at the end. And please also keep an eye on the chat box where we'll drop in some useful links. And if you experience any technical difficulties at all during the webinar, please let us know in the chat box and we'll attempt to resolve them. And if you wish to use subtitles, they're available to enable at the bottom of your screen by choosing Show Captions under More. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we'll share the recording with you via email as well as a feedback survey. We'd really appreciate if you could fill in the feedback survey to let us know what you thought of the webinar. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to hand over to Lucy Heyman. Lucy's a vocal and performance coach, a researcher and a lecturer, and she's the co-author of Musicians' Health and Performance Manual, Sound Advice, the Ultimate Guide to a Healthy and Successful Career in Music. And she also runs the Musicians' Health and Performance consultancy, Elevate Music, and the Elevate Music podcast. She holds an MSc in Performance Science from the Royal College of Music and a BA in Music from Bristol University. And she's a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, and she's also, and we're very proud that she's a member of the ISM. So thanks very much, Lucy. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for your very kind words there, Ruth. I'm going to share my screen, so hopefully we should have the first slide on the screen, and hopefully everyone can now see that. So today we're going to talk about staying mentally and physically well during these challenging times that we're facing at the moment. So as Ruth said, I am a vocal and performance coach. So a lot of my work is centered around removing the barriers that musicians face with their performance. So things like health issues or any problems they're facing with their craft, and also optimizing performance. So looking at how we can improve musicians to do the things that they want to do better. So that involves a lot of performance psychology. I've also done research on this topic at the Royal College of Music. And I have 20 years now of music industry experience. I trained classically. I was in a more sort of popish band. I've worked touring with big artists from the pop and the classical sector. And I've also been a Peri for nearly 10 years. So I understand the challenges that music teachers can face working in music as well. So hopefully we've probably got a broad spectrum of musicians and genres on the call today. So I'm going to do my absolute best to try and make it all as relevant as possible for whoever is watching, including peripatetic teachers. So we're going to start off by talking about mental health and then looking at nutrition, vocal health, musculoskeletal health, and some of the ISM services. So what we're hoping to do in this webinar is to identify some of the things that maybe as musicians you're more susceptible to experiencing than the general population. And I'll talk about how you can access free services for those things, but also some general health and wellbeing advice, as well as advice that is tailored more to the financial challenges that we are facing at the moment. So I'm sure that many of you are aware that musicians are more likely than the general population to experience mental health problems at some point in their career. So mental health problems already affect 1 in 4 people. So the amount of musicians who are going to be affected is is huge. And thankfully, because this conversation has been raised so much now in the last sort of 5 to 7 years in the music industry, we now have some really great support services for musicians. So we're going to be talking a little bit today about what you're able to access and how you can access that support. But just for a bit of background, obviously, I don't need to tell you all that the music industry is competitive and unpredictable, and it's an incredibly challenging place to work. This was all before COVID. And some of the issues that we've seen since the pandemic, well, I mean, people are obviously still getting COVID and we're still being impacted by it. But these problems have really been exacerbated in the last 18 months or so. We're now seeing that musicians are contacting support services more than ever for help with things like performance anxiety after quite a prolonged break. We obviously now have the challenges of Brexit with visa issues. Many support staff, so sound engineers and things, have now left the industry. Obviously, venues are experiencing huge costs in how much it costs to heat and light a place, and obviously a lot of audiences are now not returning to concerts in the way they were before. So all in all, this makes for a very, very challenging landscape. And so if you are finding it particularly difficult at the moment, please know that you're not alone. This is a very difficult time, and musicians' health support services are really trying to do their best to support you all as best as possible. But just to acknowledge the fact that it is a very, very tough landscape at the moment. So there's obviously general advice that I can give that we will come on to shortly. But firstly, I want to talk about what you need to stay mentally well. So one of the challenges that we're going to face with our own mental health is that we experience things very, very differently. I mean, if we just take performance anxiety, for example, if you speak to 5 musicians about how they experience music performance anxiety and in what context, you'll probably get 5 different answers. And as a result, that means that there are 5 different ways that they're all going to experience that are best for them to manage that. So I take performance anxiety as an example, but if we look at mental health across the spectrum, what is it that you need to stay mentally well? So for example, Ruth kindly mentioned that I co-authored a book. And me and my co-author at the beginning of that process, we had a chat about what do we find are the things that really help us. So I'm a huge advocate of meditation, and for her that was an absolute no-no. She prefers to take a walk in the middle of the day, get out, get some fresh air, and that does exactly the same for her as what meditation does for me. So a lot of advice in this area isn't so much about telling you what you need to do. It's about encouraging you to think about yourself and think about the things that you really need to stay mentally well. And these can be as basic as a good diet, good enough sleep, but it also can be about boundaries and about connecting with community and feeling that you are not alone, and that you have respect in your job and that you have security. And again, these things like security are very difficult for musicians who may not necessarily have long-term contracts. So yeah, have a look at these. These are not exhaustive. There are obviously plenty more, but it's worth taking some time to think about these. We'll come on in a minute to diet more specifically, but sleep is a huge one in terms of looking after your mental health and your physical health too. And I'm sure a lot of you will know that your resilience levels really dip if you haven't had a good night's sleep. And so some of the guidance around that is to make sure that you can eliminate anything that will wake you up in the night. So earplugs, eye masks, they're all fantastic. You want to try and have as dark a room as possible. Avoid blue light, so that's playing on your mobile phone for at least an hour before bed. And ideally, one of the best things you can do as soon as you get up in the morning is to go outside and try and get some light on your body and in your eyes, because that's very good for resetting the rhythms that will help you sleep later on in the evening. So first of all, if you are experiencing mental health problems at the moment, I would encourage you to find out what you're eligible for. There are so many different schemes that can help you with therapy and support, but also hardship funds. So we're going to come on to the ISM counselling sessions in a second. But there is a lot of help out there at the moment, and It's all available. There's a lot tailored for musicians. There's also a lot of government support. So again, have a look online, see what you're eligible for, and it will probably be incredibly tough, but try to be open about the challenges you're facing, because if you are able to acknowledge that actually you do need some help, that's when you can take the first steps to applying to one of these organisations who are here to help, and then they can actually help you. But it all starts with actually looking at your situation and saying, yes, maybe I do need some financial help here, and being able to communicate that to whoever you approach. And so we have a number of organisations, obviously the ISM first of all, and we've spoken about the ISM counselling service. I have a slide further on that's going to go into that in more detail. There's also for musicians BAPAM. So this is the British Association of Performing Arts Medicine. So BAPAM are there for really targeted health support. So if you I mean, obviously we've got the ISM counselling, but for more complex psychotherapy, they are able to help with that with regards to mental health, but they're also able to help with physical health. So they have all kinds of resources and fact sheets. They run webinars like these. They run workshops, drop-in sessions. You can also speak to a vocal rehabilitation coach for any complex vocal issues. So if you're not able to get what you need, if there's another level of detail that you need that the ISM aren't able to support, BAPAM is available too. We've also got Help Musicians. So during the pandemic, a number of organisations came together and created something called coronamusicians.info. And although we're not still in the thick of the pandemic as it was with the lockdowns, there's still a lot of really good advice on there. If you've had a short career break, if you're looking to get back, there's so many resources. And they also have a service called Music Minds Matter. Again, lots of resources and videos on there. The PRS Members Fund, they're able to offer hardship grants, winter heating funds. They can also help with housing costs. So that's a really good one for any of you who are registered with the PRS. We have music support for anyone experiencing substance abuse issues or substance use issues. They have all kinds of workshops and people you can speak to about that. And the Royal Society of Musicians, again, they are fantastic for hardship funding or able to fund certain aspects that you may not be able to pay for to do with your health and your music career. So there's a lot out there, which is a good place to start. Now, obviously as a musician and during very stressful times, especially if you're trying to make up a lot of money for the shortfall of these rising prices, it's going to be incredibly stressful, and portfolio working can be really stressful. We've probably got people here who are musicians and peripatetic teachers, and so juggling those sort of two career lives is also incredibly hard. So these are the NHS 10 stress busters. So these are just some ideas about how to manage stress overall. So the first one is be active. So get outside, exercise. Again, I've said it before in terms of knowing what works for you, but think about what do you actually need in order to take exercise on a regular basis. So for some people, it might be, you know, I've heard stories of people taking a really good novel on an exercise bike in the gym, and they think, if I'm going to be able to read that novel, I can get to the gym and do that. For other people, it might be team sports, buddying up, doing something with somebody else, or it might actually just be, you know, that you need some headspace on your own. But there's a fantastic book called Atomic Habits, and I don't know, I really recommend reading it. But essentially what they say in that is that you're always trying to put barriers in the way of things you don't want to be doing and remove barriers to the things you do. So when you're thinking about being active, what are things you could do that would actually remove the barriers? So maybe if you wanted to go for a run in the morning, for example, could you put your running things out and your running shoes at night and make sure that you've actually cleared some time in your calendar to do that? But again, get curious about what it could be for you to take it that would work to get active, and think about how you can remove the barriers to make it more likely that you're going to do it on any given day. So taking control of your problems. This may be something that you need help with, in which case the ISM counselling would be a great place to start. There's also an ISM helpline that can actually point you in the right direction for whatever support it is that you need. Connecting with people. So it's been a very strange time with everything being online for the last few years, but hopefully we're all able to get out and connect now with more people. But obviously there are some who are still immunocompromised who aren't able to do that. So just being aware that connecting with people can be a really stress busting thing to do, and kind of working out ways that you could do that. If there are community groups, if it's catching up with friends, if it's organising, putting some time in the diary to do that, think about what would be the best way for you to do that. I'm sure that the vast majority of people on this call have very, very busy lives. So remember to schedule some me time in that for whatever it is that you want to do. Sometimes I find that musicians, they love what they do so much that they might think that sort of actually playing music or listening to music is actually some downtime for them. But I would encourage you to try and do something completely unrelated to music for a little bit of your day, just so you can actually have that space where your working brain isn't overanalyzing or thinking about work in any way. Challenge yourself is a funny one, because obviously it depends how challenging your life is at the moment. So apparently a certain amount of challenge is really good for us, and it helps us to grow, and it helps us to sort of reduce stress. But equally, if you will know yourself how challenging your life is at the moment and whether you can take on any more challenges. We're going to come on to burnout in a second, but that's one I definitely say you probably want to assess for yourself. Avoid unhealthy habits. So you will know what your unhealthy habits are if you have them. Well, we all have them, let's face it. But it's to what extent are they impacting on your life in a negative way? And if they are impacting on your life, again, try and find ways that you can make it more hard, more difficult to so they're not as automated. For example, I find that not buying chocolate or having biscuits in the house is really helpful, because then I have to go to the shop to get them, and sometimes I can't be bothered to do that. So that definitely helps to improve that kind of unhealthy habit. Helping other people can be really good for feelings of well-being. And working smarter, not harder. So this can be working more effectively, being very good at time management, and understanding when you need breaks. So there's a Pomodoro technique where I think you work for about 30 minutes or so, and then you set a timer and then you stop, and then you have to get up for 5 or 10 minutes, make a cup of tea, and then come back. When I was writing a research paper, this was a godsend, because it felt incredibly overwhelming and stressful. And by chunking it down into 30 minutes, it was made it a lot easier. And also, it's a really important thing to mention for practice for musicians. So there's been a lot of research about the most effective way you can practice, and it turns out that the Pomodoro technique and effective practice are very, very similar, because they also advise not to practice for more than sort of 30 to 45 minutes at a time, so that you can be as concentrated as possible, and also it reduces the risk of injury. And then set a timer, because once we start, it's really easy just to get carried away and think, oh, I'll keep going. But you always want to be very focused in your practice sessions, and actually keeping a log of what you're doing can really help too. Then take a break and come back, and then you'll probably find you're refreshed and you can carry on much more efficiently than you could before. And most importantly, you will have had a break, which is great. Try to be positive, according to the NHS. It can be really hard to do when things are really difficult. But again, find things that you can do to bring you joy, even things like, going for a walk or cuddling a dog or a pet, or spending time with family and loved ones, and try and get those positive injections into your day, even if you're finding it hard to be positive. And accept the things you cannot control, which is a lot easier said than done, but it's very good advice. And again, this may be somewhere that you can seek professional help to get some guidance around this if you need it. Excuse me, for some reason it wasn't going on. Okay, hopefully that will work now. So burnout is a topic that we've heard a lot about in the last couple of years. We have had, it feels like, unmanageable levels of stress for quite a long time. The World Health Organization definition is that it's resulting from chronic workplace stress, which has not been successfully managed. For so many of you, you won't have an official workplace, and you won't have an HR department that's responsible for making sure that you're not overly stressed, or that there's no one you can go to seek help with this. So sadly, it can become very easy for musicians to have chronic workplace stress that is not successfully managed. The definition, according to the World Health Organization, some of the things to look out for are feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion, increased mental distance for one's job, or feelings of negativity or cynicism related to one's job, excuse me as I pull my bar down so I can see the bottom one, reduced professional efficacy. So you will know when you're not being as effective at work, and you start to get that creep of cynicism coming into your work, and you start feeling like, what's the point of it all? This is speaking for someone who's had experience of this, and it's not much fun. And in my case, I needed time out, and I'm pleased to report that that did the job. But it can be very, very challenging to manage. And again, if this is something that you're experiencing, it's worth giving, if you're an ISM member, give the ISM helpline a call, which we'll come on to, or the counselling service, and really get some support for it. If you're not an ISM member, it might be worth calling Music Minds Matter from Help Musicians. So they're also able to help with calls of that nature. So when I was writing the book, I spoke to a number of professionals about how best to manage burnout. And what the process was, what research was suggesting was people were experiencing, apologies, I need to go back. Excuse me, I'm going to have to come out of this temporarily just to go back to the previous slide. And I think that may have now stopped my sharing. So I'm going to come back and share my screen. Apologies for this. Hopefully that should now work. There we go. I'm afraid I have some other windows that are part of the webinar that were covering up the picture that I wanted to read. So I tried to read them, but hopefully that should now be working. If we do play from current side, we're back. Apologies for that. So in this graph here, you can see that at the top, we've got balance. So this is how we are when we are normal and healthy and well and going about our lives. Now, you can see one before. What tends to happen is we have a very, very busy schedule, and maybe suddenly we're actually experiencing more demands on our time. So we start cancelling the coffee with the friend. We maybe cancel that engagement in the evening, and we say, oh, actually, I've got to work this evening. I'm so sorry. And then maybe we say to our partner at the weekend, I'm going to have to work this weekend. I'm so sorry. And what happens with that is slowly, we don't realize, but those things, the coffee with the friend, the relaxing weekend, the drink with catching up or with some girlfriends in the evening, those are the things that actually rejuvenate us and give us the energy to keep going with the difficult things. So when we start occasionally socially withdrawing and then doing that more and more, our lives then start becoming harder and harder, and we're not creating that energy pattern that we need to sustain us. So you can see then we have changes in sleep patterns as we become more stressed and our lives are completely dominated by work. And then we have a lack of energy. And then eventually we have this exhaustion. And so when I spoke to this psychologist who specializes in burnout, I said, well, what advice, what is it that causes people to burn out? And what is the thing we can do to stop that from happening? And he said, it's all about joy. When we are going towards burnout, we stop having joy and we stop seeking joy. We increase the workload and all the things that give us that natural exuberance and that natural resilience, we cut out. So it's a very simplistic overview of burnout. And I appreciate it's much more complex than I'm making it sound. But I would encourage you, if you are in a really stressful time, please try and find ways to increase the amount of joy that you're experiencing on a regular basis. And maybe, maybe have that coffee catch up half the time, or maybe again, think about working smarter, not harder. But it's really important to keep those activities in that really give us our energy back and that are very revitalizing and sustaining. So here we are, how the ISM can help. So there's a 24-hour personal support and advice helpline. So this can be for all kinds of things or all kinds of problems that you're experiencing. So from bereavement to work-related stress. So that's a really great first port of call. You can also talk to the helpline about concerns related to debt and financial matters. And ISM members can also access counselling and cognitive behavioural therapy. So this is a really wonderful method of support for members, and I highly encourage anybody who is struggling to seek help and give the ISM a call. I think Ruth will probably be putting all the links to these services in the chat. So if you want to find out more, have a look in the chat and there should hopefully be links there. So I mentioned that eating healthily is a really important aspect of looking after your mental and physical health. I'm sure most people will know this, but as an overview, you want to be getting protein, fruit and vegetables, grains, and for those that can tolerate it, things like calcium from milk and dairy. So obviously this will vary slightly if you are a vegan, but things like protein, especially for musicians, it's really important to try and get protein in most meals for the sustaining energy sustaining qualities that it has. You may find that actually if you are doing quite a full-on physical day as a musician, a slice of toast in the morning may not actually be good enough. You may need a much bigger protein hit. But one of the challenges when budgets start getting smaller and costs of food starts going up is how you can actually stay healthy and eat healthily with less money. So this is not exhaustive, but I've put together some ideas about eating healthily on a budget. The first point I've put, try tinned and frozen fruits and vegetables. Actually, I'm extending that to all foods. So meat tinned and frozen meat is much cheaper than fresh meat, and it's normally just as good and just as fresh and healthy. And obviously we've got tinned things like tinned fish, which is very good because you don't have to cook it. So that saves on costs. But frozen fruit and vegetables are, again, just as healthy and fresh as fresh ones, and sometimes actually even fresher. Sometimes they freeze them almost just after they've been picked, whereas some of the fruit and vegetables that we have, might have been lying around for a while, especially if you're trying to buy the reduced versions of them. So obviously you probably all have very busy lives, and planning ahead is probably absolutely vital in order to stay healthy and also to avoid having to pay extra money when you're out and about for food. So I'm sure you all know this, but even things like taking leftovers in a Tupperware. So for peripatetic teachers, often I found that the staff room always had a microwave in the corner, which was just so valuable. I find that some musicians who tour quite a lot have a soup maker, and they say it's very easy just to get hold of vegetables when they're out and about and just chuck them in a little soup maker. I don't have one myself, but apparently they're not very expensive and they're a really good way of having things when out and about. Also, things like cutting up carrot batons or celery and putting those in a Tupperware. I like little packets of oatcakes, so you can get plain oatcakes. They're great. I mean, they're not the most exciting, but if you're really hungry and you need something, that's quite good. And cheaper cuts of meat. So a lot of recipes will say chicken breasts, but you can always supplement things like chicken thighs and chicken legs. If you're looking to make a chicken soup, things like chicken wings are very inexpensive. And we can always opt for whole grain versions of bread, pasta and rice. So they're exactly the same price, but they're much better for you. They've got much more fibre. Obviously, we've mentioned a little bit about repurposing leftovers. So always try and reduce food waste where possible. Obviously, generally for the climate, it's good, but also for your pocket, it's good. And microwaves and pressure cookers. So there's been a lot of chat about air fryers and how incredibly cheap they are to run. The most efficient ways of cooking. Batch cooking can be great. So making, for example, a really big lasagna and cutting it up into smaller portions and freezing those. And also, I don't know if anyone knows Jack Monroe, but she is absolutely fantastic. She's written a great cookbook called Tin Can Cook, and she's got all kinds of cookbooks, but she's got lots of recipes available online for free too. So she's great. She's a first port of call if you want incredibly healthy recipes that are very cheap and easy to do. If anybody has any other really good suggestions, please feel free to put them in the chat and we can have a discussion afterwards about what you find works best. So I'm going to come on briefly now to vocal health, and some of you may think, oh, okay, this doesn't really apply to me, but for any peripatetic teachers, I would really encourage you to stay. I find that most peripatetic teachers are actually professional voice users, especially if they have any duties in the classroom music teachers, taking assemblies. So as soon as you are shouting over a hall to children, or you're in a group music lesson and you're shouting over instruments for children to stop, you are using your voice in a very different way than you normally would on a regular basis. So I just wanted to quickly go over a few important aspects of vocal health, and also things to look out for if you may be experiencing problems, because Peripatetic teachers are just as likely to experience voice problems, and I'm sure many of you here are probably thinking, yes, I quite regularly struggle with my voice, especially when you combine, it's normally that second term from January to about March when all those coughs and colds are going around. Well, they're actually going around at the moment, so we're probably experiencing that now, but then combine that with trying to shout a lot, and you can get voice problems quite quickly. So your body is your instrument and you need to look after it. So that the reason why I say that is that if you have a cough or a cold or a virus that you're experiencing and you're using your voice a lot, it's going to take a toll much more than normal. So you need to look after your body and your health as much as you need to look after your voice. So even for people who do quite a lot of talking, if you're peripatetically teaching all day, you can find you get home and think, I just can't speak anymore, I'm so tired, I don't want to use my voice. So even warm-ups and cool-downs that singers use can really help if you're talking for work all day. I'm just going to go over a lot, and sorry, also a lot of the problems are preventable. So I'm going to go over just some little bits, tips of guidance, and then we'll talk about where to go for help. Okay, so for any professional voice users on here, as in actual singers and performers, I would really recommend getting a good vocal coach. So I'm sure that classically among you are thinking, what? We all have vocal coaches, what's she talking about? But I am regularly horrified by how many people get referred to me who are maybe singing stadiums or pop artists who have never had a vocal coach, and they've been able to rely on their voice to a certain point, and then once the workload starts really increasing, that's when the problems start. So for anybody who is a professional singer and doesn't have a vocal coach, I highly recommend getting someone that you can just at least do a sort of MOT with, or an overview, just to check that you're singing in a really safe way. So there's some other guidance here: staying physically fit, drinking plenty of water. So it's worth mentioning as well for the teachers that it takes 4 hours for the water that you drink to hit your vocal folds. So if you wake up with quite a dry voice, it's worth starting to drink water then, because your body actually needs to absorb the water and then it gets to your vocal folds. Because anything that you drink or swallow is not going to touch your vocal folds. So it's just a good one to remember, because there's a big market in teas and lozenges that don't go anywhere near the vocal folds, and they don't really do anything, basically. Unfortunately, research has suggested. Good rehearsal habits. So for singers, make sure that you've got adequate monitoring, so you're never having to force your voice. Use voice rest if you need to. Choosing repertoire carefully and getting plenty of rest. So this obviously is just such a brief overview, and we don't have time to go into huge detail, but just these are a few pointers. These are some of the things you should avoid. Excessive use of the telephone. That's a funny one, I know, but we talk differently on the phone to how we talk normally. So often I find that agents are often putting phone interviews in for artists before concerts, and and in that hour before, oh brilliant, or 2 hours before, you can do another interview there, and that's actually a really bad time to do that kind of thing. So it's worth knowing that and actually being able to say to people, please, I can't do any promo before you're on stage. And so also when you're going at concerts yourself, shouting, these are all places where you're going to cause problems. Eating a large meal before bed, because that's more likely to increase reflux issues. So your own voice, even your speaking voice. If you have any of these warning signs, normally after 2 weeks if they've lasted for 2 weeks following the resolution of a cold or a virus, this is when you go and seek help. So you can seek help from BAPAM, and I highly recommend getting in touch with BAPAM first. They have specialist voice clinics with vocal rehabilitation coaches, and you will get a much faster treatment than you would from your traditional GP, especially for professional singers. So they understand that you need to have this sorted quickly so that you can get back to work. And the guidance for any kind of issue, whether it's vocal health or physical health, is if you're experiencing problems, don't sit on it. The sooner you seek help for problems, the sooner you're going to get support and you're going to get that problem resolved. It's when problems are not dealt with and they're much further down the line when you go and seek support, that's when they can actually have much more complex long-term problems arising. So here we go, vocal SOS. So if you are a singer and you have to be on stage that night, Don't panic. I highly recommend steaming. So steaming is fantastic. You have I've got one in front of me. You have a clay pot with a little with a little clear glass pipe coming out of it, and you pour some boiling water in, and you inhale the steam, and that does get to your vocal folds. So it's the quickest way to hydrate your vocal folds. So I have a slightly I know you can hear I've got a bit of a frog in my throat at the moment. So I had a good steaming session before this, just to make sure that my voice would carry me through. So if anyone wants to know more about steaming, again, please feel free to put something in the chat, and I can show you how it works after that, after the session. Guidance, clear guidance. If it hurts to swallow, don't sing, and seek professional help as soon as possible. So again, something that you might see, musculoskeletal health, and think that it doesn't apply to you if you're a peripatetic teacher. It really does. Very sadly, the rates of musculoskeletal issues in musicians are unbelievably high. There have been so many research papers on it. One suggested 74%, and the others around this similar area. The musculoskeletal problems that musicians are going to experience at some point in their career. These include joint pain, sort of hypermobility problems, RSI, focal dystonia. They're really, really serious problems. And so if you have any pain to begin with, please seek help for it. The ISM has a physiotherapy service that we're going to hear about more in a second. But it's really, really important, again, to get issues dealt with as quickly as they can. Often sort of poor technique can really cause problems. And I've got a little bit of a blank over, I'm afraid. One of the screens is over the other bit of the slide, but often we find that it's when there's a change in repertoire, sudden increase in playing, but also, yes, poor technique is a huge one. Here we are. Yeah, so the risk factors, something to be aware of. So if you suddenly are going from a standing start, so this was something that a lot of people experienced in the pandemic. They weren't playing much, and then they tried to quickly get match fit for their concerts that were coming up afterwards, and there were a lot of injuries and a lot of people struggling with a sudden increase in practice. So I would say if you've had a bit of a break, make sure you taper your practice session so it builds up gradually to reduce the chances of injury. And be really aware that if you change the type of repertoire that you play, the technical demands that are on your body or on your voice are going to change too. So be aware there that you might need more support. And also setup of equipment and posture. So I remember when I was a peripatetic singing teacher, for example, I would be put into spaces sometimes that, for example, like a piano with a generic plastic chair, which was completely at the wrong height, or you'd be asked to play in a hall with maybe like a kind of higher stool. There wasn't the resource to give you a proper pianist stool. And during that time, I actually developed shoulder issues because I was quite regularly playing without having good posture. So I would really encourage you, if your school is like that, to try and seek the correct posture that you need. And speaking to a physiotherapist, actually, who can advocate on your behalf and say, no, this is what you need. I didn't realize at the time that it was such a problem and that it was going to cause problems. I just wanted to go with the flow and be very accommodating and not cause, not ask for special treatment. But I realize now it was actually very, very important to get the setup correct. And often, I was even asked to teach in a broom cupboard quite literally once. So I know I do appreciate that it's not always, you're not always able to get everything that you need, but as long as you are, you're aware of what you can do to as best as possible to try and support your posture and your technique, that's great. And so to prevent injury, we see that increased levels of cardiovascular fitness really helps. Dr. Sarah Upjohn has done some great work recently pushing for actually warming up the body. So we all have our instrument and vocal warm-ups and cool downs, but actually doing something to get the blood pumping. So it could be jumping jacks, it could be going up and down the stairs, but that increased blood flow can really help to reduce the amount of your susceptibility to injury. And also include a physical cool down. So this is something that again has come up quite recently in the literature, and not everybody does, but it's really, really good and can really help with injury prevention. So as you see here, the ISM has a physiotherapy service. So I highly recommend getting in touch with them if you're experiencing any problems. They can give you an initial assessment and then give you exercises or a self-treatment plan, or you can take it to wherever you work and say, come on, this is what I need. So somebody else advocating for you can often be really helpful. Now, I'm aware that some of you on this webinar may not do touring anymore, or you may not tour at all, but I wanted to touch on touring just generally to have a think about planning ahead for any kind of eventuality you might be doing as a musician. So I will use the example of actual touring though. So we find that people who have actually established healthy routines in advance of going on tour, experience more healthy tours themselves, rather than suddenly trying to eat healthily for the first time on tour or trying to run every day or whatever. If that habit is well established, it's much easier to carry it on. Managing social issues before leaving, if there are things you need to sort out, it's great to be able to actually have those clear and out of your head so that you can focus on the job that you need to do when touring. So I've listed a number of things here. Obviously now with Brexit, visas are a little bit more of a challenge. So the ISM has a visa, some visa advice. Ruth is going to put a link into the chat of where you can access that. And you can see I'm not going to go into detail with all of them, but it's just about being really prepared and thinking about what you're going to need. And for example, if you're away for a long period, have you got enough medication to cover you through that period? Have you sorted insurance? And also being realistic about shows, knowing that actually on a long tour, bad shows will happen. And just being ready for that and acknowledging that that will happen will help you have a much more realistic experience of touring. And staying healthy on tour. So we've spoken about healthy diet and sleep. Some people find that they get really lonely on tour, and actually loved ones think, oh, they're having this amazing time, I'm not going to bother them. So it can be really good to actually communicate with your loved ones and say, you know, I find this really difficult, can we stay in touch, or, you know, whatever it is. And one artist I know likes to send postcards of wherever she is on tour to stay in touch with her friends and family. So think about ways that you can do that. One thing we haven't really touched upon is hearing, so using earplugs. The Musicians Union have a hearing health scheme, so I think it's for £50. You can get a hearing test and you can get access to custom molded earplugs, which are normally about 200. So that is a really great scheme. So I think that's Help Musicians and Musicians Union. And then post-tour, people often find it really hard when they come off tour. So maybe in advance, scheduling catch-ups, knowing that it's going to be a bit weird for a couple of days. And this is where you can do all the sort of the day-to-day things like getting help with health issues and raising problems with your management, but also reviewing your tour and thinking what went well and why, and what didn't work and why, so that you can have a more successful tour next time. So that is the end of the official webinar. So thank you very much for listening. I'm going to stop sharing my slides now, and I think we're going to go back to Ruth, who has got some questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lucy. That was a really interesting and yeah, really interesting presentation. I picked up lots of tips myself. I'm sure everybody else did too. So in terms of questions, we've had a few on the Q&A, and we've also had quite a few questions in advance. So we'll maybe just go through as many as we can of those in the time that we have remaining. So somebody asked about the steaming that you mentioned for vocal health. Just could you say a little bit more on how that works?
Of course, if you don't mind me just stretching over, I will actually get the steamer, because I do find it's a lot easier to show people how it works. So this is the steamer I use, which I highly recommend. It's a Dr. Nelson's inhaler. So that's what you need to do if you want to Google it. It's a clay pot. And what you do is you essentially, sorry, I'll just keep holding it. You take off the bung on the top and you fill it with boiling water, so up to about halfway. And then you leave it for about a minute, because the steam's really, really boiling at that point. And then you breathe in through this, and you just breathe like that for about 10 minutes. And what happens is the steam comes up and hydrates your vocal folds. So these are absolute godsends, and everybody who I work with who's a singer, I encourage them to get one. What's really good about this one is it is, and I promise you I'm not on commission, these are just the best ones that I've found. The good thing about these ones is that they are not you can control the temperature basically. So if you go on Amazon, you can get facial steamers, but they often continue to provide the steam at boiling point, so which is what you need obviously for a facial steamer, whereas for singers we need it just under boiling point, so it's actually not going to be too hot that it's going to cause any damage. So what you do is you fill that up, you breathe through the nozzle for about 10 minutes, and then you rest for a bit, probably about 5 minutes, and then start to do some very gentle sirens, and then start sort of warming your voice up again from there. But they're really good for SOS on the day of a concert when your voice is really croaky and you need something quick.
Brilliant, thank you. That looks amazing.
I think they're between about £20 and £30, so they're not cheap, but they last forever basically. So once you've done that, another thing you can do, you can go into a shower, and you can turn the shower, if you're in a hotel room for example, turn the shower on boiling hot and get the room to fill up with steam, and then do it that way. So you can be creative about ways of finding steam, or from a mug as well, but again, just make sure it's not too hot.
Yeah, I've tried it before with a bowl and a tea towel over the head. Not very glamorous.
Yes, yeah. You want to make sure you breathe them through your mouth, because I know that in the past we've done that for when you're blocked up and you've got a cold. So for this one, you want to make sure it's definitely your mouth that you're using for that.
Great, thank you. We also had a question sent in advance about prioritising your time when you're a parent. So if you're a musician and a parent, and you're sort of juggling your own needs with your children's needs, do you have any tips on how you can approach that?
Yes, well, I'm not a parent myself, so I can't speak from experience, but I have done some work with parents in performing arts, and they are absolutely fantastic. They're doing great work. So yes, thank you very much. Julia has put a link to parents and carers in performing arts in the chat, so I highly recommend you checking out Pippa. That's what they're known as.
Brilliant, thank you. We also had a question about time management, how you can carve out time for yourself if you're a busy freelancer and you've got kind of irregular schedules. Any advice on that one?
I guess that's it's quite a hard question, because it's quite situation dependent.
Yeah.
So I think it all starts again with, like we were talking about with the slide, with staying mentally well, like knowing what you need, what do you want from that time, and then finding ways that you can do it. Because even things like, if like I really love podcasts, and actually I know that walking with a podcast can be me time, and actually I can do that if I'm walking to another appointment. So for example, in that situation, I might not get the tube, and I might actually just walk with a podcast, but it's very much about finding out what the person needs, and is there a way of almost kind of like doing a hack with that to make that happen. So another one that as I mentioned before, I'm a really keen meditator, and I have been known on a train just to close my eyes and actually just meditate on a train, which I think people just think I'm snoozing, and lots of people are having a little sleep sometimes, especially around the Christmas season. So it's kind of being a bit creative about finding ways that you can get the headspace or the switch off time from work that you need in those times where you actually have to travel or you're doing something else, I think. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think there are some good meditation apps that can probably help there, like Headspace, and I'm sure there are many more. We also had a question sort of similar to the previous one about switching off from the news cycle, because obviously there's a lot going on at the moment. The news can be pretty depressing, and there's a lot of sort of big world issues that we're all grappling with. Have you got any tips for kind of switching off and trying to have a break from that at all?
Again, I think it comes back to being very self-aware and knowing what stage you're at with it. I go through periods where I personally delete my social media apps and sometimes even my news apps, because I definitely over the last few months have got to that point of just needing to know, and it becomes such a negative habit. And I find if I actually delete those apps, again, it's a bit like the Atomic Habits book, then those kind of pathways are reduced. And if I can actually Google the news and look at the BBC News app through Google, but it's just not quite as addictive. And the same with social media. I sometimes find that I'm actually logging on through Google. It creates that wall where it's not the easiest thing to do. So I find that having clear times. Okay, I will look at that once a day at this point, and putting boundaries in place. And obviously, as you say, you know, it depends where we are. Sometimes we can all do these things in healthy ways, but I think if we have the awareness to see that the way that we're doing it is actually slipping into becoming unhealthy, and most importantly, if it's actually having an impact on us, if it makes us feel very anxious, or, you know, I would really encourage people to kind of be self-aware when they're using these apps or reading the news, and how is it making you feel, and actually, do you want to feel, how, you know, what is it that you want to feel, and what can you do to actually protect that? I think especially when we're working and we need to be in a certain frame of mind, or we need, you know, or maybe we're experiencing challenges in our lives and we need that resilience, then maybe during those periods, that's actually when we take a step back and find ways that we can actually carve out those times. But again, yeah, just making it less easy to do the things that we know are not supportive of our health.
Yeah, that's really good advice. Thank you. We had a comment about nutrition and a question about nutrition as well. So someone just made a comment that eating chocolate biscuits doesn't have to be labelled as unhealthy, that, you know, we can feel good about snacking sometimes. I think that's, you know, very true.
Absolutely. I apologize that I was just using an example from my own experience, because for me, I find that once I start eating chocolate biscuits, I mean, the whole packet's nearly gone, and I'm quite bad at portion control, so I find it easier to have them out. But absolutely, I enjoy treats, as everybody does, and but for me, I much prefer kind of going out and or, you know, being very mindful about when I'm having it, rather than it being there and a sort of a way of, yeah, trying to get through a stressful afternoon, rather than just actually enjoying it for the lovely food that it is.
Yeah, definitely. And I think treats are different for everybody, aren't they? So, you know, do what works for you. We also had a question in advance about prioritizing good nutrition if you have an irregular schedule, you know, if you're working during meal times. Have you got any advice on how you can kind of eat healthily, even if you're, you know, gigging during dinner time, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think it's just really about planning ahead, looking at, you know, if you're doing a show, when is best for you to eat before a show. I often hear people saying that they're too nervous before shows and they can't, so they don't want to have a meal, or they don't want to eat anything. And some people don't even eat for the day of a show, and I encourage those people to maybe think about how they could, you know, if I say, could you have a protein smoothie? Often people are like, oh yeah, I can have a smoothie, that's okay. So trying to think about ways to actually make sure that, firstly, that you do have enough energy for the show, because, you know, an athlete wouldn't go and do a sprint if they didn't have any food and, you know, any fuel, or you wouldn't take the car for a drive without filling with petrol first. So firstly, do try and think about what the job is that you have to do. Have you got enough nutrition and fuel to get you through that? But absolutely, it's a really difficult one with people who do really late shows, because obviously, as I mentioned, reflux is a problem for people who go to bed, who eat really late at night and go to bed immediately. So if at all possible, maybe like an early supper if you've got a 9 p.m. show, and as I said, smoothies and things. But yeah, getting prepared, as I mentioned, sort of preparing things in advance. I mean, it's very ridiculous, but also I used to take things like a bell pepper, like a green pepper, and snack on that before a show, as a way of, you know, just getting some vegetables in and not having to chop it up in advance. But yeah, it just all starts with preparation. And sometimes I think on a Sunday, you know, I have a paper schedule, or people have, you know, have ones on their phone or computer, and just looking at an overview, and actually sometimes taking the time to think, what can I cook? Where could I create those healthy meals? Could I make something on a Sunday that will actually, I can freeze, I can bring that out on Wednesday. But it's quite boring, but it's about being really, really organized, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Preparation is key. We had a question about boundaries for freelancers, which I think is something that comes up a lot when we're talking to self-employed musicians. And they asked, how do you approach setting boundaries with employers without coming across as difficult or unwilling? And kind of basically how to say no, but kind of maintain those good relationships with people that might be offering you teaching or gigging. I know that's something we come across a lot at the ISM, and it's perhaps not a perfect answer, but have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it is such a difficult one, isn't it? And I think, if there was a perfect answer to this, I'd like to hear it, because it's definitely something I've experienced in my life and continue to. I guess the first thing that comes up, though, for me is that I think sometimes one of the challenges around setting boundaries is actually knowing what our boundaries are ourselves. So taking the time to actually know what we need in any given situation. And that sounds very simplistic, but sometimes it's not actually, we're not really sure. We just know that that thing has made us feel uncomfortable, or we don't want to do it, and we're not entirely sure why. So I'd say number one is about being very clear about what the problem is yourself. The second one is about being able to be very clear with your employer, I would say. And so being able to communicate that very clearly with your employer. The more clarity you have, I think the more support you're probably going to be able to get. The third one is actually, if you can solve the problem for them, I think that makes a huge difference as well. So if you go to them, you go with solutions, not with problems. So I've got this, I really need this in place. In order to support me, it would be this. Please, could we make this happen? Then I think the outcome is going to be a lot better than turning up and saying, I can't do this, without having a clear explanation of what you need and why. And I think so much of the work with all of this is about getting to know ourselves and our working practices and what we need in order to have the best performance or the best work-life balance that we need. One way you can do that is actually looking at a time when you were either performing really successfully, or you felt that you had a really good life balance, and actually looking at some of the things that you were doing during that period, maybe who you were working with, how you were working, and actually almost modeling your own success and saying, well, what can I bring back from that period to today, and how can I make that happen now?
Yeah, definitely. I think also something that might be helpful is the ISM has a how-to guide on negotiating a contract. So if you are struggling with that negotiation process and you want to learn how to add in things that might help you set those boundaries, that might be a useful resource to look at. But yeah.
Also to mention, which I know I haven't mentioned in this webinar, just in case people aren't aware, because I know that I had a very tricky situation, and I actually consulted one of the ISM lawyers a couple of years ago who were incredibly helpful. So yeah, it's probably worth mentioning about the legal service too.
Definitely, yeah. So if you're an ISM member, you can contact our in-house legal team at any time with any kind of queries to do with your work as a musician, and we can pop a link in the chat about that as well. I think we've probably got time for one final question. You mentioned performance anxiety and touched on it a bit, but just wondered if you've got any sort of practical tips for musicians who might be suffering from performance anxiety, or any signposting to resources that might be helpful.
Absolutely. So the first thing I'd say, which I touched upon, is that performance anxiety does seem to affect people differently and in different contexts. And you can perform quite happily for your whole life, and then it will suddenly come out of the blue. That has happened too. So it doesn't really follow. It's not a very predictable thing, basically. If people are experiencing performance anxiety, it all starts first of all with, again, that clarity of how it affects you. So what situations make it worse? What situations make it better? I find that looking at how you prepare to perform can make a huge difference. We've only got 2 minutes, but one of the models I really like is looking at, there's the 3 different areas, thinking about the task mastery, the environment, and your trait anxiety level. The task mastery is how good you are at the thing you are. So that means, are you under practiced? If you are, you're probably going to be more likely. Imagine this is a slider. For slider 1 is going to be quite high. You're probably more likely to experience performance anxiety. So how can you make sure you've got to grips with the program, that you really know what you're doing, you're well rehearsed? The second one is the environment. So is this a very different environment for you? If so, you may experience it more, and get familiar with an environment, and just knowing that there are going to be these differences with repertoire, with environments. And thirdly, if you have trait anxiety, so if you are anxious as a person, generally then seek professional help, because you will experience performance anxiety in a more pronounced way than than most other people. But it's a huge topic that I get to touch on in such a short space of time. The only other thing I'd say is that you do actually need a bit of it. So the goal is not to get rid of it. There's a really great model called the Yerkes-Dodson U-curve. So for anyone interested, have a Google of that. Essentially, it's like upside down U-curve, and it shows us that when our performance quality is quite low, when we don't have any performance anxiety or arousal, and our best performance is normally when we have a certain amount of that arousal that elevates our performance. Obviously, when it gets too much, it then falls down again, and it can sabotage the performance. So the challenge is to get it to that middle point, and actually thinking about a musician, how can you prepare yourself, and just before you go on stage as well, to get yourself into that sort of star where you are ready for the performance, but not going to be too nervous.